alive at that point. Did anybody watch the show MacGyver? Anybody? Okay, quite a few people. Yeah, so you remember this guy, Angus MacGyver. He's a government agent of some sort. I didn't watch the show a whole lot, but I heard about it. But Angus MacGyver, he's this guy. He's very smart. He has a really broad scientific knowledge, and he's very resourceful. He can pretty much, whatever he needs to do, he can take whatever ordinary materials he has at hand, and he can put them together with a little bit of duct tape and make the tool that he needs to accomplish pretty much any job. And that's pretty cool, and I admire resourcefulness whenever I see it. But really, when you look at somebody who is really resourceful, if you sit there and think about it for a while, that example ought to kind of point you toward God, because God, above and beyond any being in the universe, is, you might say, the ultimate example of resourcefulness. You take away, even MacGyver, you take away his duct tape, and he might be stumped. But there's no such thing as a shortage to God. You might even say, you can say God took nothing and nothing, put them together, and made the whole universe. In Hebrews 11 verse 3, and remember, you do have in your bulletin, you do have the outline for this lesson. You've got some blanks to fill in. And as we go along, fill those in with me. And you'll also have your scripture references. But the first, number 1, we'll jump right into the fill in the blank portion right here. And the first point I want to make is that God can build great things with minimal raw materials, or for that matter, with any raw materials at all. And the example I'm giving here, God essentially, from what we can tell, nothing at all, He created this whole vast universe. Hebrews 11 verse 3, our first scripture reference, essentially says that. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Whatever those invisible ingredients were, we don't know, but God, astronomers estimate, if you could count the grains of sand on all the seashores of the earth, over the whole surface of the earth, take that number, all this is that big string of zeros, multiply that number by 300, and maybe you've got an estimate of how many stars are out there. And God spoke those into existence from, we don't know what, but God did that. Then you jump forward to the Gospels, and it was tough to feed 270 people for Texans for Christ. We had to roll up our sleeves and get to that. But in Matthew 14, Jesus made a meal to satisfy, keep in mind, 5,000 hungry people. And what did he have at his disposal? He had 5 barley loaves, he had 2 fish, and not only did he feed these people and fill them up, he had 12 baskets full of food left over. So when you have a God who's that resourceful, you take a weak, flawed, ordinary person like me, and I may not be much to look at, but I'm more than enough for God to do anything He wants with. And that's true of anybody in here. In fact, actually, if you look at the pattern in the Bible, God actually prefers to do great things through fragile, ordinary, broken people. And He lets us know exactly why that's His his way of going about things, because that way the glory goes to God and not the instrument He is working through. You think about it, if I'm going to be effective in the job that I'm doing here, not my ideas need to be coming out, but the stuff in this book needs to be coming out so that the glory goes to Him. In 1 Corinthians, Paul told us very clearly in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27, he said God through ordinary people, verse 29, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 29, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Then in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7, he again cites God's reason for doing amazing things through ordinary people, and he says to show, 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And so God is faithful to, and here's the second Roman numeral to fill in, God was faithful to this pattern that we've established here when He chose the ordinary man, those are your words there, the ordinary man, Abraham, to essentially launch his chosen people, the Israelites, through. And we're going to spend the next few lessons, about 4 lessons, we're going to spend talking about Abraham and trying to learn some lessons from his life. Abraham, very interesting guy, worthy of our attention and study. God chose to place him in the lineage that extends from Adam to Jesus, from Adam to Christ. Abraham lived quite a long time ago, lived about 4,000 years ago, and yet here's this ordinary man who doesn't enter the picture until he's around 75 years old, and even today, Christians claim him, Jews claim him, Muslims claim him. Billions of people in the world still identify themselves with the man Abraham, and yet we really don't know a whole bunch about him. Abraham, when he's introduced to us back in Genesis, he's not introduced to us, at least initially, as an especially good or moral or righteous man. Abel is. In Genesis 4, verse 4, we read that the Lord had regard for Abel. Noah has a pretty nice introduction. In Genesis 6, verse 8, we find that Noah found favor. Genesis 6, verse 8, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Job, very first verse of the book, Job has a really good commendation. Job 1, verse 1, we read that there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And yet, going back to the present account, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, Abraham kind of has a neutral introduction. Not really good, not really bad, kind of neutral. Genesis 12, verse 1, the Lord simply said to Abraham, "Go from your country and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." And we're burning through the outline here. That brings us to our third fill-in-the-blank point, Roman numeral 3. God is going to, for what reason, only God knows why he did, but God elects to make some very significant promises to this man. The word is promises. God elects to make some very significant promises to Abraham. Among these, he says, "I'm going to bless you." He says, "I'll bless others through you." He goes on to say that I will make you a great nation. But before he says any of these things, first thing he simply says to Abraham, he says, "I want you to leave everything that you know, and I want you to travel to an unknown destination." Now, right there, that's a. What if I asked some of you to do that this morning? You'd probably need to go have a swim in one of the lakes around here, right? Tell me to go jump in the lake. But that's what God comes and says to Abraham, and Abraham left. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of Mesopotamia, which is right around where Iraq is in the modern geography. Abraham left a pagan culture. What Abraham's beliefs were initially, we don't know. We do know the part of the world he lived in. There was a pagan culture. Pagan deities were worshipped. Presumably, the God of the Bible was a new God to Abraham, who just spoke to Abraham one day. And why did God choose Abraham of all the people he could have chosen? We don't know. How did God reveal himself? Was it in a dream? Did he speak out of the sky as a voice? Did he come and appear as a person? We don't know. How did God establish his credibility and authority with Abraham? Abraham had to put some faith. There's some means by which God acquired Abraham's faith, and we don't know what that is. We don't know any things, but we do know this. We know that to Abraham's credit, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, Hebrews is a great commentary on the Old Testament. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, we read that by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, here's the remarkable part, not knowing where he was going. That's what the writer of Hebrews tells us. Now think about that. You're 75 years old. You've lived your life, your whole life in one place. And after that, you're in probably one of the most enlightened places in the world. The land of Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization. He left an advanced civilization. At 75 years old, he probably had an established reputation and a good name. And yet, he pulled up stakes and left. Think about, if you're at that stage in life, how hard it would be to just pack up your U-Haul and leave your home not knowing where you're going. That's a big, big step. And add to that, again, we don't know what Abraham's religious beliefs were previously, but we know the religion of his fathers would have said that to die outside of the land of your fathers was to forfeit the afterlife. So Abraham is really taking, in his mind, a breathtaking risk. He's taken a huge leap of faith. And let's not forget about Sarah, his wife. Abram's around 70. Abram, as he's known at this point, is around 75. His wife is 10 years younger. She's 65. When she leaves her home behind, she's leaving a big part of her identity. Those of you who women understand, who you are is tied up in your home. That's your DNA. That's how God made you. It makes you good at what you do as being a homemaker. Archaeology would tell us that in this part of the world, homes commonly would have been tiled. A lot of them would have had indoor plumbing. A lot of amenities that weren't found elsewhere. And yet, Sarah is going to leave this behind for a nomadic existence, camping in a tent for the rest of her life. You know what? I like to camp. But give me a couple nights, and you know what I like? I like to go back home and get a shower. That's it. It's fun, but then you get your fill and you're ready to go back home again. But imagine you're going to go out and you're going to live in a tent from now on. There's no end in sight. That's what Sarah does. And add to that, Abraham and Sarah, when they get to the place that God will eventually show them, they get to the land of Canaan, and imagine that you move to a new house and you go and you walk in and there's a family that you don't know sitting at the table eating supper. And you've moved here and you left your home behind where you came from, and your home is already occupied. That would kind of be tough to deal with. But when Abraham gets to Canaan, the land is occupied with Canaanites. It's full of Canaanites who don't have any plans of going anywhere. And not only does he get to Canaan and find there are strange people there, but there's also not a whole lot of food. Because you see, Abraham arrives either in a famine, a food shortage, or a famine begins shortly after he gets there. And so if you're Abraham, I imagine he's at some point thinking, what in the world have I done? That's probably where I would be. To Abraham's credit, he doesn't turn around and go back home to Ur. I'm sure he could have. However, at this point, Abraham, from what we can tell, seems to be taking matters into his own hands. In Genesis 12, verse 10, we read, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." Now we know God told him to leave his home in Ur of the Chaldeans. We don't have any indication, however, that God told Abram to go to Egypt. From what we can tell, this is Abram's idea. Abraham doesn't want to starve in Canaan. He also doesn't want to get murdered. He doesn't want to get killed in Egypt. And so he puts his, evidently still acting, doing things on his own, by his own ideas. He puts his wife Sarai at this point, in a pretty awkward situation. In Genesis 12, verse 11, he makes a really big request of her. Genesis 12, verse 11, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. So say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." Now, this is partially true, because Abram and Sarah are half brother and sister. They share one parent in common. But of course, we know on here, Abram is really trying to mislead people. And, a half-truth, basically, if you're telling a half-truth, you're being deceitful. You're lying, and that's what Abraham is doing. Sarah, sure enough, she's a beautiful woman. Amazingly, she is 65 years old. But at this point, people are living a lot longer, and so the aging process is evidently going along at a different pace. But Sarah's beauty comes to Pharaoh's attention, sure enough. In Genesis 12, verse 14, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And sure enough, Abram was right about that. She would turn a king's head. She was that beautiful. And Abraham's plan seems to be working, at least at first. If you jump on down to verse 16, for her sake, he, being Pharaoh, did well with Abram. And he, being Abram, had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants, female donkeys and camels. And so not only is Abraham still alive, he lives, he doesn't get killed, but he profits handsomely. But when Abraham does things his way, and that's Roman numeral 4 there, when Abraham does things his way, bad things start to happen before too long. Genesis 12, verse 17, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. This has always been a little bit puzzling to me because Pharaoh was innocent. He, in good faith, did what he did. And yet Pharaoh is being punished. So what's going on here? What's happening? I think there's an answer, and I think it's this. I think it's that God, first of all, God is showing Abraham patience. God is showing Abraham grace, but God is also teaching Abraham a lesson, and he's giving Abraham a second chance. Now, we think of Abraham as being a man of great faith, and he is, but it's important to realize that when Abraham really shines brightly, he is around 115 years old probably, when he's willing to give his son Isaac back to God as a burnt offering. His faith has matured a great deal, and while Abraham is still a good man and a man of faith, his faith hasn't grown to that point by right now. He's not there yet. He's headed there, but he's not there yet. But if you jump forward about 24 years to Genesis chapter 17, Genesis 17 verse 1, God says something interesting to Abraham, and he says this: when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. Then notice what he says in verse 2, that I may. See the conditional language here? He says, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. You hear that? There are some... God has promised these blessings to Abraham, but those blessings are going to be contingent upon Abraham's obedience. God is saying, I will bless you, but I will bless you when you trust me enough to follow my lead, to do what I say, to go where I tell you to go, even in a famine. Now consider this. Consider that 400 years later, at the time of the Exodus, when Moses is leading the Israelites, consider that God is going to feed more than 1 million of Abraham's descendants for 40 years in a pretty barren wilderness where there's not near enough food to support this crowd. God's going to feed the Israelites with bread from the sky. He's going to feed them with quail that just let themselves be caught. And when there's not water around, God will bring water gushing out of the rocks. So God can do that. God can certainly nourish Abraham and Sarah and Lot and his family and the servants, the men servants and maid servants and the livestock. He can certainly take care of them during this famine in the land of Canaan. God is saying, I will bless you. God has told Abraham, he said, I will bless you and I will make you a blessing to others. I will bless others through you. But notice what happens when Abraham goes to Pharaoh. Now, notice what happens when Abraham goes to Pharaoh, but notice what happens to Abraham when he goes to Egypt. Abraham does things his way there, and you see a blessing to Pharaoh? He's not a blessing to Pharaoh, he's a curse to Pharaoh. And that brings us to Roman numeral 5. God's blessings to Abraham and through Abraham hinge on his obedience. Those are the words to fill in. His blessings, God's blessings to and through Abraham, hinge on his obedience. Now, Abraham is a great man of faith, and he's a role model for us. But remember, who he becomes is not somebody he becomes in the snap of a finger. He grows to his most exemplary point over a period of many years, longer than most of us will live. Abraham is a flawed sinner. He needs God's grace and mercy and forgiveness just as much as the rest of us. Abraham sins. He falls short of the glory of God just like the rest of us. However, even at this point in the story, we're already seeing some of the seeds of Abraham's greatness. He's already taken a breathtaking leap of faith. He's already given up a comfortable status quo for future blessings and for a future that he will never see. He will see Isaac, but he's not going to see the nation that comes from Isaac. And as far as the promised land that God's going to give to Abraham's descendants, the only piece of the promised land that Abraham will ever own will be the plot of land where he will bury his wife Sarah. Roman numeral 6 then. He being Abraham has already shown us a lot about living by faith. He's already shown us this. Living by faith is living for something today that we will never see while this life lasts. Those are the words to fill in. Living by faith, it's living for something today that we'll never see while this life lasts. And Hebrews, again, the writer of Hebrews tells us that. In Hebrews 11, verse 1, the writer of Hebrews says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of what? Things not seen. For by it the people of old," like Abraham, by the people of old received their commendation. So we've spent a little time looking at Abraham. Now let's turn the focus and let's look at us. What about us? When obeying God is scary, will we do things our way, or will we do things God's way? I don't know what the future holds. I do know I've heard government people in positions of government, people running for office, saying things like, "We've got to change the religious beliefs in this country." That's ominous. Is there persecution on the horizon? I don't know what the future holds. I do know we have to be ready. Persecution has come to people of God before, and I think it's highly presumptuous to say that it will never come again. We don't know what it's going to cost down the line for us to be faithful to God's Word, but we have to be ready to be faithful to God no matter what, even when it's scary. We're all called, just like Abraham, we're all called to leave the familiar on a journey to an unseen homeland. Remember, this world is not our home. What did Paul tell the Philippian Christians? We're all citizens of Texas. No, we're all citizens of heaven. But remember, we're not gonna see that country in this lifetime. Again, God gave Abraham a second chance when he lost his nerve. And sometimes we lose our nerves, and sometimes we fall short. God gives us grace and mercy too. Thank God for that. I need it. I don't know about y'all. I think we all need it. God, again, like Abraham, God will bless us if we will obey Him. But we won't be blessed, and we won't be a blessing to those around us if we don't obey God. So let's be like Abraham. Let's not get sidetracked. Let's journey toward our homeland. You know, human logic says that Abraham should have stayed in Ur of Chaldea, Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. He had a good thing going there. If it had worked out for his first 75 years, probably would have worked out just fine for the rest of his life. Abraham's journey, probably a lot of people back in Ur were scratching their head when Abraham was rolling out of town. They're thinking, what in the world is he doing? Where is he going? Abraham's journey to Canaan only made sense if God's promise to give that land to his descendants was true. That's the only way you can reconcile it and make any sense out of what Abraham was doing. And God He's done the same thing with us. He has made promises to us that won't be fulfilled in this life. Just like Abraham, we need to be willing to believe God's promises and follow Him even when it's scary. We need to be willing to follow Him even when it hurts. And when people look at the way we're living, We're supposed to be a peculiar people. People ought to be looking at the way we live, and they ought to be scratching their heads, and they ought to be saying, why do these people live that way? And there's only one thing that ought to reconcile our actions. There's only one thing that ought to make our lives make sense, and it's this. We are living in a way that only makes sense because God's promises are true. If we look like the rest of the world, we're not supposed to be fit in. We're supposed to stick out in a good way. God called us to be holy. He called us to be different. So let's be that holy people. You have been promised a magnificent homeland. Remember what Isaiah said? He said, I create new heavens and a new earth. And when you see it, well, the old things won't be remembered. They won't even come to mind. When you get there, you won't remember Ur of the Chaldeans. You won't remember Mesopotamia. You'll be thinking, wow, the only reason why I ever loved this world was because sometimes it looked a little bit like this. It's worth getting to, but it takes a leap of faith. So this morning, if you haven't begun that journey of faith that begins right here, accepting God's gift of salvation in the waters of baptism, or if you've wandered off and you're trying to sell out, trying to do things your way, remember, you're giving up God's blessing, and you're giving up being a blessing to those around you. So if you need to get back on the right path, let us take you by the hand, and let's make that journey together. Whatever your needs are this morning, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and as we sing this invitation song.
Savior, lead me lest I stray.